Hello class, welcome to this lesson where we are going to dive a little bit into the details of inheritance and some exceptions to the rule. This is really going to help for us in understanding some of the nuances of inheritance and some of those tricky questions that may show up on the AP exam. Let's take a look. The first thing we need to remember is our friends, the access modifiers. And the two access modifiers that we have learned in this course have been the private modifier and the public modifier. And if you'll remember, we want to, for the most part in this class, have all of our methods be public, meaning that it is accessible to outside classes. It means that we can use this anywhere that we're going to use this object. We're going to be able to access anything that is determined to be public. Private means that we can only use that data or that method, that field or method is only usable, only accessible within a class. So we can only use private data within this. And this is also true for inherited objects. So a private field cannot be accessed. It can only be accessed by its class, which means it cannot be accessed by inherited classes. But this doesn't mean that that doesn't exist, that field doesn't exist. So when we, at the top of our data, at the top of our class rather, when we say something like private int, I don't know, private int, or private data. When we declare something like this, and then we inherit from that class later, this is still created. It's still instantiated when we create that object, and we still store the data. So the data is still available but we're not able to access it because of this private data, this private modifier. And that's where we want to use our friends, the setters and getters. Use public setters and getters. So this is how we're able to get that private data and break that encapsulation barrier in a controlled manner so that the object is still controlling its own data, but we're able to access the data as we need using our setters and our getters. So that is the first nuance we need to be aware of. If we said this, if we said that we had a public integer, public data, we would actually be able to access that integer from the child class without having to use super or this. We could simply use that variable name. And that would be really confusing for programmers because you would never have to see the declaration of that variable name. And now all of a sudden you're using secret variables that you never declared. The programmer who comes by after you and reads that wouldn't know what's going on. And you wouldn't get a compile time error. Java wouldn't give you any warning because it would be totally usable if we instead said private or public int public data there. So we want to make sure that those are private, so we're being very secure with our data, and we're also being aware of the programmers coming after us, reading that code, and getting something useful out of it. Okay, so this is something we need to be aware of when we are writing, and of course, every single piece of data in all of your classes, every field needs to be private. Let's talk about an exception to inheritance, and this is our friend constructors. So constructors are not inherited. Constructors are not inherited. You must describe and you must include your constructors in your inherited class. So if you want to instantiate your child class, you must include, this means you must include constructors. In the child class. If you don't declare a constructor with a certain parameter list in the child class, but is declared in the parent class, and you try to use that parent class constructor on a child, you will get a compile time error. So you must include constructors in the child class, and you can only use child class constructors to instantiate in a child object. Just fit it in there. So we can only use a child class constructor to instantiate a child object. There's another exception to this. The other exception to this is default constructors. So default constructors are the exception to the exception. If you do not declare any constructor within your child class, Java will automatically inherit just the default constructor. So default constructors are inherited if no constructor is defined. So default constructors are inherited if no constructor is defined, but there must be a default constructor in the parent class. So there must be, so this is only if the parent class has a default constructor. So only if the parent class has a default constructor will the child class inherit that default constructor if the child class does not define any constructors. And recall that if we define, that Java will provide a default constructor if we don't specify any constructors, but as soon as we define a single constructor, that default constructor no longer exists. So recall that Java provides a default constructor only if no constructor is defined. Only if no constructor is defined. Why does this work? Well, actually, if we think about the rule that we just stated here, every single object in Java, every single class inherits from a class called object. The object class, which sets the defaults of things like toString and our equals method. It creates and defines those different methods. Everything inherits from object class. An object class includes a default constructor. So if you don't define a default constructor, if you don't define any constructor at all, then Java will inherit this default constructor from our class object. Let me do that again. So it will include the default constructor from the class, the object class. As soon as we define a single constructor within any object, we no longer inherit this default constructor from object. And that chain continues all the way up. As soon as we define a single constructor, we no longer inherit the default from the parent. These are some details that we need to keep in mind when we are looking at and building our own programs, and these are questions that may come up in the AP exam. All right, class, that's everything for this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.